We're talking right now in a series. We're doing a series on people of incredible faith and people who acted when most of us, to be honest, probably wouldn't have acted. You know, they came upon a situation and they went for it, and maybe we wouldn't have, we maybe might need a little extra push. Or people who move forward when we would be tempted to retreat. People who never gave up when maybe there'd be times we would be really tempted. I'm sure there were times he was tempted to quit. But Nehemiah is who we're talking about today because he fits all of these things. He moved when other people wouldn't, or people didn't. He went forward when other people were trying to get him to retreat. He fits all this criteria today. And for the sake of context, I want to give you a little history of Nehemiah. So put yourself like your history hat on, just for a second, to kind of get an idea of where this fits in to what we've been talking about. Last week we talked about King Nebuchadnezzar sweeping into Jerusalem, carrying off exiles. And this included the four people we talked about last week: Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Daniel, and there were many others that they took out of Jerusalem into Babylon. This was 597 BC. 11 years later, Babylon attacks Jerusalem again. They left some people there. They didn't kill everybody, right? They just took the brightest and the best people away. They killed some, obviously, but 11 years later, they go back. They pillage and burn the city. They knock down the walls. They burn down the gates. They destroy the temple. They also take another 60 to 80,000 or so more people back into exile. That didn't last long. 47 years later, Cyrus the Great invades Babylon, turning it into a Persian colony. So things are changing. It's 539 BC. We got new leadership in place. Within a short time, after taking over Babylon, Cyrus issues a decree that the people can go back home if they want. We took all these people here, and of course, a lot of those are gone. We got second-generation people happening now. But he issues an edict granting Jews the permission to head back to Jerusalem if they would like to, back to their homeland. So people return in three separate waves back to the homeland. It doesn't happen all at once. One happens in 516 BC, which is, takes a little time. They rebuild the temple built on top of Solomon's old temple that had been destroyed. They rebuild a new temple. So here's the new temple, and they dedicate that in 516. So there's a wave of people who go back then. A few years later, 458, 455, somewhere in there, Ezra, a prophet, brings another group back, another wave of exiles returned back home to Jerusalem. And then just a few short, 10 or so years later, Nehemiah brings another group back. And that's who we're going to talk about today. And the story of Nehemiah and what he did that was so significant. Why do we have a book of Nehemiah? Who cares about Nehemiah, right? I mean, actually, we do care. He has some great leadership that he displays in what he does. So we'll take a step back now. Nehemiah hasn't returned yet. He's hanging out in it'd be now Persian. He's a significant person in the Persian court, position of honor and prestige. Because I remember they took the young Jewish boys and they brought them over and they trained them to be in the court and to be in leadership. And so he's one of these guys now that a generation later is in the court and in a position of influence. One day his brother comes to him from Jerusalem and he tells him some very bad news about his homeland. Here's what's going on in Jerusalem. Here's what's happening. It's in Nehemiah chapter 1, the second verses 2 and 3. Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived the exile, concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. Now, this is significant, right? I mean, you have to have a wall, especially in any time. A place needs a wall. It's a protective thing for them. It protects the city against thieves, against invaders and raiders from foreign nations. I mean, they just need to have a wall for protection. But the walls are down. Anybody at any time can just walk in there and cause trouble and steal things and hurt people. And that's what's been happening there in Jerusalem. And the people are basically sitting ducks, being mistreated by all their surrounding neighbors. Well, the news devastates Nehemiah, and he begins to pray. The first thing he does is he prays. He doesn't just stomp around, get mad, and throw things. He prays. It's in verse 4. As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. So it hits him right in the heart. I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And I said, "O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive." Hear me, God's what he's saying. "Let your ear be attentive, your eyes open, to hear the prayer of your servant, that I now pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the people of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Even I, my father's house, have sinned." So we've all sinned. We know why we got here to Babylon in the first place. We have disobeyed you, is what he's saying. There's a confession of sin there. Verse 7, "We have acted very corruptly against you, not kept the commandments, the statutes, the rules that you have commanded your servant Moses. Remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you're unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are in the utmost parts of heaven, from there I will gather them and bring them to the place that I have chosen and make my name dwell there. They are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power, your strong bond." He's reminding God of this great promise. If we sin, you're going to scatter us. If we repent, you'll bring us back home. So he's remember that, God. And then he says in verse 11, "O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and the prayer of your servants who delight to fear your name, and give success to your servant today, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man." What's going on here is that Nehemiah sees a serious, serious need. His homeland is unprotected. Jerusalem has no walls. There's no protection for them. And he mourns. People are getting hurt. He prays and he fasts. And he keeps this going for a number of weeks. I mean, it's not like just a quick prayer and then going on to the next thing on his schedule. This affects him deeply. And he prays for weeks about this until he finally decides to do something about it. And 4 months later, Nehemiah shows up in Jerusalem, and he takes a 3 days to walk around the city to inspect everything, to kind of see what, just for his own self, what disrepair the wall is in and the gates and so forth. And he sees how they're torn down. He sees how the gates are destroyed. And he feels this strong urge, this calling from God, I've got to do something. I can't just be sad about it. I can't just be angry that this happened. I have to do something about this. It's his call of God on his life, is how he describes this. Have you ever felt strongly God calling you to do something? Some type of service, some type of ministry, some type of study, some type of change in your life, something. Where God has been working on your heart saying, I really want you to do that. Maybe it's to get involved with an individual to help disciple them. Maybe it's to make some serious changes in your life, to accomplish some type of task or something. Something that just grabs your soul and you just can't rest. You've got to do something. Have you ever had that feeling of God just saying, I want you here to do this? I felt that in 4th grade. I just felt this very distinct. Can't even explain it. Don't even know how I knew it. I just knew God wanted to be a preacher, And so in 4th grade, I started preparing myself mentally for what that would look like, and even spiritually for that, for what a 4th grader knew what to do. Now, I would love it if the story of Nehemiah just stopped right there, because isn't that great? God calls someone to do something, and then he says he's going to do it, and he prays and fasts, and it's like, celebration, the wall's done. But that's not how the story goes. As you read through the rest of the book, as a matter of fact, that's rarely how it works for any of us. It's never just an easy road. So rarely is that the case. And it certainly isn't for Nehemiah here. And if you ever feel the call of God on your life to, like I say, either make a change in your life or to build some kind of ministry or to be involved in some type of ministry, to accomplish some type of task for Him, if you ever feel God calling you to do something, it will be filled with challenge, right? It will be filled with even heartache sometimes and hardship. So, spoiler alert, okay, Nehemiah does build the wall, all right? It does happen, but he's going to go through an incredible amount of opposition. I mean, there's going to be an incredible amount of trouble that he goes through. And this is where his faith comes out. Because it's one thing to say, I'm going to build the wall, and the wall gets built, and that's really great faith. Well, that's cool, but the faith comes when the opposition comes and he still does it. That's where we see his faith. That's where we see him saying, I'm going to do it anyway. I don't care what's going around. God's going to help me. God's going to make this thing happen. And this is what we can learn from when we face troubles in life, our own selves, and if we want to win in these troubles. Let's look at how faith helps keeps us on track. And I only have two or three, but that we're going to look at. There's more in the story, but I just ran out of space and time. How faith keeps us on task with our mission. First of all, faith overcomes criticism. You get involved in ministry, you'll hear criticism. It's just what it is. It's going to happen. Nehemiah does too. Chapter 4, verse 1. When Sanballat heard that we were building the wall, he was angry, greatly enraged, and he jeered at the Jews. And he said in the presence of his brothers in the army of Samaria, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Are they going to get the temple going again? Like, really? Are you serious, right? Will they finish up in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish and burned ones at that? Like, I mean, they don't even have any stuff to work with. This is silly," he's complaining. Tobiah the Amorite, verse 3, was beside him, and he said, "Yes, what they are building, if a fox goes upon it, he will break down their stone wall." Like, it's just going to be garbage. Criticism. You put your heart to do something for God, somebody will find something wrong with it. It's just going to happen. There will be people who criticize your work. I don't know why. They just do. I mean, I'm sure I've been guilty of it myself. I mean, it just happens. Sometimes we just do that. Sometimes maybe they just think differently than you. You're doing a task, they're thinking, "You don't really need to do that. You should do this." It's just they're just thinking different. They're wired different than you are. Maybe it's because they're jealous that you had the idea and they didn't, or God's using you and really aren't using them. Or maybe they're just evil. I mean, sometimes that's the case. There are evil people. But they'll say things like, "Well, you're not good enough for that. Oh, that's not going to work. Your plan is just dumb. It'll never work. You don't think this is important, do you? Why are you doing this thing? You're not doing it right. You're wasting your..." I mean, they'll have all kinds of criticisms for you. If you're trying to make changes in your life, how many of you heard this? Especially when you first come to Christ, you're thinking, "Okay, I got to make some serious changes," and you have a lot of friends that are around you that maybe don't believe like you do, and they're not really worried about pleasing God in any way, and you're trying to figure out how to walk a godly path. They're going to surround you, and they're going to be like, "Man, this isn't going to work. You'll never last. This is just a phase you're going through, a fad. We don't think you're going to last." And people will start saying you're going to fail spiritually, and you know how it goes. I mean, for most of us, as sure as this way for me, you can have literally thousands of positive comments come your way. You're going to remember the one that isn't. When you go to bed at night, you're going to remember, "Oh, that one person who said I was a dummy," or that one. You can have people just praising you up and down about something. You'll remember the negative comment, and that's kind of how we're wired. The challenge is to hear these voices and not get discouraged. If you have this call from God, you really feel God has called you to do something, you will hear the criticism. And the challenge is to not focus on it, but to work through it. Look how Nehemiah responds to this criticism. He prays. He doesn't get mad and throw stuff back and say, "Oh yeah, but you're dummies too." He prays. Verse 4, "Hear, O God," and actually his prayer is kind of, well, you can see for yourself. "Hear, our God, for we are despised. Turn back their taunt on their own heads. Give them up to be plundered in a land where they are captives. Do not cover their guilt, and let not their sin be blotted out from your sight, for they have provoked you in anger in the presence of the builder." He actually goes on the offense on his prayers, like "God, just take them down." I mean, you can pray that way if you want, but give them the consequences of their own words. I mean, he's like dishing it right back at them. I guess I've kind of done that before. When I was a pretty young preacher, back when I knew everything, I had probably 6 families that were really working hard to get rid of me in the church I was in. I mean, they were conspiring, picking apart sermons, writing notes, calling each other after each week, like, hey, do you think he said this wrong? Do you think he did that wrong? And making phone calls and pointing out imperfections, pressuring leaders to fire me, and they were critical about everything. I mean, they just didn't like me for whatever reason. I'm a likable guy, aren't I? I don't know. Not always. Probably especially when I was in my 20s. And it was a classic battle of the flesh and spirit, right? In my flesh, I wanted to fight back. In my flesh, I was like, oh yeah, that's what you think. Well, let me tell you what I think of you. I mean, that's our natural stance, right? We want to go back at him. And in my spirit, I knew there was probably a better way to handle this. There had to be a godlier way to handle this than just to trench in and fight and argue and debate and to point out all their weaknesses and all their imperfections, and start throwing mud back and forth at each other. So my spiritual side was let God take care of it. My physical side was I can take care of this. I can take all of these people, And that flesh and spirit battles can be pretty wicked that we face in our own selves. You go back and forth, you go back and forth. I was determined. One of the things I've done right in my life, I was determined to let the Spirit win on this one. That doesn't mean I was always perfect, but I was determined to make sure the Spirit won in this battle. So I started praying, and I started fasting, and I might have even turned some of these prayers on God. Just bring this back on and make them look foolish, because they were like making stuff up. That I was just like, what? I mean, it was actually offensive to me that they would say I would do some of the things they said I was doing, and it just wasn't, right? And so I went to God and I prayed and I prayed and I prayed. I prayed that God would lead the church through the challenge. I prayed that God would silence the voices that were being untruthful. I mean, I can take legitimate criticism. I mean, nobody's perfect. I have room for improvement and everything. So that stuff doesn't bother me, but the untruthful stuff was getting to me. I prayed that he would help me not respond to the criticism in an ungodly way. And a funny thing happened again, it wasn't just like a one-time prayer. It was like a day. I just kept praying this. Because it was a lot of stressful time at the moment. And a funny thing happened over the next 6 months or so as I continued to pray. A couple families mysteriously got job transfers. I tried not to smile when they said they were moving. I said, "Oh, that's a good opportunity for you and God," and they moved away fairly suddenly. This one was sad, and one had a pretty major health issue that just caused a distraction, and that they couldn't deal with the silly stuff like me. So it got them thinking about other stuff, and there was a couple others that were just kind of bandwagoning, so that like when they didn't have the other voices to conspire, they just kind of grew silent and became quiet. There's no one to join the party. So it turned out to be a very peaceful and very wonderful state there several years, and had fruitful ministry, and it was a great experience when it was all said and done. But that was a rough patch. There was a really rough patch for maybe a couple years of my life. I'm glad I can look back and say I handled it spiritually. I can say I'm not 100% on everything, but I did that one pretty well. And it wasn't easy. There were times I wanted to just quit. There were times I wanted to just run. There were times I think I even did send a couple resumes out and okay, I just need to get out of here. And they sent back nice old letters saying, "Oh, you're silly. You're obviously a bitter." They didn't say it, but I'm sure the way I worded things, it was like, "Yeah, we don't want this guy. He's trouble." So I ended up staying there for a long time. Nehemiah, he prayed, and then he just let God worry about it. Man, that's the way to do it. That's the way to do it. You pray about it, put it in God's hands, trust. That's faith. Trust him to say, "Okay, God, you're big enough to handle this. I'm just going to keep working. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing." Nehemiah went back to his task with the people who were willing to work. I love verse 6, because the last part of that thing that we just read says, "Oh, by the way, so we built the wall, and all the wall was joined together to half its height." So they've got more work to do, but it's like they pretty quickly built the wall to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. Not all the people, not the criticizers, not the complainers, but he said, "You know what, we just can't focus on them. I'm going to pray, let God worry about it, and we're going to go to work." And they did it. That's how you want to handle criticism in your life. listen to it. There may be a grain of truth in there. I mean, so there usually is. I mean, like I said, I'm not a perfect guy. So there's a grain maybe of truth that I was able to learn from, but let God worry about that. The next trouble that you will face, quite potentially, happened for Nehemiah, happens today. Faith overcomes gossip. There are times you'll just face people talking about what you're doing and talking about you. Look what happens in chapter 4, verse 10. In Judah, it was said, that's always a good phrase. Oh, it's said. Okay. In Judah, it was said, the strength of those who bear the burden is failing. There's too much rubble. By ourselves, we would not be able to rebuild the wall. And our enemies said, they will not know or see it until we come among them and kill them and stop the work. So you got people on the outside of the camp and people on the inside of the camp. Both are gossiping. So the people on the outside are kind of saying stuff, and the people inside are repeating it. They're kind of starting to believe it a little bit. I love that. Don't you love that phrase? In Judah, it was said, people were gossiping. People were talking in the corners and in the shadows about Nehemiah and the project. It's not going to work. The plan isn't working. It's going to fail. We can't do this. This job's too big. It kind of goes with criticism, but this isn't criticism to him. They're just kind of whispering amongst each other. It's all going to fall apart. The gossip continues in chapter 6, and they even start kind of making things up. Because if spreading your opinion doesn't work, they'll start making things up. It's reported among the nations, kind of another sign of a gossip there. But people are saying it's being reported. This is a letter they get. It's reported among the nations, and Geshem also says it, that you and the Jews intend to rebel. This is to Nehemiah. Hey, you guys are doing this for bad purposes. This is why you're rebuilding the walls. Okay, the Jews, you intend to rebel. That's why you're building the wall. And according to these reports, you wish to become their king. And you've also set up prophets to proclaim concerning you in Jerusalem. So one of these days, the prophets will say, hey, Nehemiah is the king. You know, that's what you're doing, isn't it? Here's the king in Judah, and now the king will hear these reports, and so now come, let's take counsel together. So they're like warning the king in Persia. They're warning Nehemiah. They're spreading rumors. Hey, this is all for nefarious reasons. They're being, they're doing terrible things here. Again, first sign of a gossip. People are saying, you know how to tune me out of a conversation really quick? The generic, oh, you know what I'm hearing? People are saying this. If you ever see my eyes glaze over, it's because I've tuned you out, totally tuned you out. I'll take, honest conversation. But man, Nehemiah gets this, and he's like, okay, you're just gossiping. That's what's going on here. He responds appropriately. Then I sent to him, it's a note back and forth, no such things as you say have been done, for you are inventing them out of your mind. And he prays in verse 9, but now, O God, strengthen my hands. So he answers it, and then he goes back to prayer, and he goes back to work. Here's the deal. You can't help what people say about you. You just can't. You just got to focus on what you're doing and do your thing. The families I talked about earlier, some of them were pretty highly respected people within the church. And it got to the point when the little criticism wasn't really gaining traction, they started actually making things up. And as they were making things up, I thought, I don't know how to answer this. So I just didn't. I figured, let God worry about it. And it became so out of character for me, the stuff that they were saying, that I was doing, that eventually people were going, that's ridiculous. They just lost all credibility, and it all crumbled in front of them because they were just making stuff up. What? That doesn't sound like him at all. There's no way he was doing that stuff. And once again, the whole thing just kind of went away. So sometimes Nehemiah answers his challenge by prayer. God, strengthen my hands. And sometimes it's just sheer determination. He doesn't just sit back and pray and say, God, take care of it. He also continues working at the task at hand. In verse 13 of chapter 4, so in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, in open places, I stationed the people by their clans with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And I looked and arose and said to the nobles and to the officials, to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. So he puts up guards to protect them while they're doing the rebuilding. He also, the builders are holding weapons in one hand and building with the other. It was we will not stop. We will not stop. We are going to build this wall. And they took measures to protect themselves and continue the task that God had called them to do. There's actually 7 distractions in Nehemiah that we could talk about, but there's just no way. We don't have time. We just went through, a couple of them, and there's no way we could do the whole thing. I started with a list of 7 this week, and I finally thought I just got to cut it off at some point. There's personal temptation that Nehemiah has. He was given the allowance and the food of a governor. He could have eaten well above everyone around him, and he chose not to. He continued to work and be with the people around him. There were threats against him. There was slander against him. There were 7 different things that could have stopped him from building this wall. But the important thing to know is that if you're doing something for God, if you're doing something, whether it's making positive changes in your own life, you're straightening up your life, you're living, trying to figure out how to live like Jesus. It could be something as big as that, or it could be teaching a class or a Bible study or a small group, leading some type of ministry that God's called you to lead, or anything. Whatever it is God has you doing, just know there's going to be times you'll have opposition. There's just going to be times that people within even your friends will have opposition, and people from without will have opposition for you. Expect it so that you don't be surprised and shocked and dismayed and upset and disappointed when it comes. Some people will complain about what you're doing. Some will misrepresent what you're doing to other people. Some will try and stop you from moving forward. And they probably don't even know they're doing it. A lot of times it's not like evil. They just don't realize what they're saying and how they're affecting you. Just expect it to happen. And when it does happen, just pray about it. Don't get mad. Don't think of them as the enemy. Don't avoid them the rest of your life. Just pray about it and move forward with determination. I was listening to a video this week. Sometimes I like to just kind of listen to a video on the topic that I'll be teaching on this week. Sometimes it gives me ideas, sometimes it doesn't. And I listened to one this past week, and I heard this quote. And I mean, the guy was just talking, so he didn't mean it like some significant quote. He just said it, but it caught my attention, and I had to like, rewind it, go backwards in the video, and like listen to it again, and just kind of pause for a moment and just kind of let this soak in, because I love what he said. He said, if you know God has called you to do something, what difference does it make if it's going well today? They could have the gossip, it could be slanderers, there could be threats, there could be people trying to shut you down, whatever. If you know this is a God thing that you're doing, making changes in your life, some ministry, whatever, if you know it's from God, what difference does it make how it's going? You're doing what you were called to do. I need to hear that sometimes. Church leadership can be an emotional roller coaster. I mean, it's just crazy, the ups and downs that can happen. And I just need to remember sometimes, no matter what's happening around me, I'm just doing what God called me to do. Just keep doing it. Just keep doing it. You need to remember that when you're teaching the class or when you're leading the Bible study or whatever it is you do. Just if it's a God thing that you're doing, just keep doing it. I love that. He's called you to do something, whether it's some personal things that you're working on in your life, whether it's leading something and he's preparing you to lead something later, whatever. He's called you to do something in your life. Find the joy in what God has called you to do. No matter how challenging it can be, no matter how difficult it can be, don't be discouraged by people. Don't be intimidated by outsiders. Don't allow yourself to be tempted to quit. The thought will cross your mind, but don't allow it. Don't let anyone or anything distract you from your calling. Pray, move forward with determination, and let God do what he wants to do through you. All right?